To get started, what is infrastructure as code? So infrastructure as code allows you to manage your infrastructure through code rather than manual processes. And why do we want to do this? So the benefits are that we're able to then configure our code in an explicit manner that we can track with systems like Git and have source control on our code. So we have a single source of truth, and that way we know exactly where the change is coming from. The other benefit is that then we can duplicate this code for multiple environments. So if you have a dev and a test and a prod, you can deploy the same code with very minor changes to the naming conventions and have an exact match across your infrastructure rather than the traditional point and click and hoping things match up. So our first project, we're just going to do a main.tf to start, and we'll deploy that, and then we'll make changes. So in our first configuration, here's our main.tf. You'll see here first, let me zoom in. We have a provider, and this is going to be the open source provider. So it's usually one, like if you're working with a cloud, it's going to be AWS, GCP, et cetera. These are what configure the connections for the SDK into Amazon Web Services here. So the provider block says that we're going to be using Amazon Web Services, and we define the region. And there's a few other values, like our authentication goes through this provider. And then resource, this is the most common thing you'll see in Terraform. So the resource block is just it's a keyword in Terraform, and we define what type of resource. So that would be the AWS instance, and then what our local name is. So that'll be first server. Note this first server is just in referencing the Terraform. It is not that won't deploy an EC2 instance named first server. Next, we're going to configure our AMI. So here is the key that we're going to set, and the value will be our AMI ID. One note, you're going to want to go find whatever the latest AMI is for whatever version you want to deploy. So this one's Ubuntu. You can look up the Amazon Linux AMI for whatever region you're working in. Next up, instance type. Again, self-explanatory, but we're explicitly setting what type the instance is going to be. So this one's going to be a T2 micro, and then we're going to set some tags. Now, what are the commands with Terraform? So first, you're going to want to run Terraform init to initialize the project. That will basically pull in all of the providers that we're going to be running with. And then Terraform plan. So this is like a speculative run. We're basically going to take what our Terraform is configured and then take what our state currently is, which we'll talk more on state in a minute here. And what's the difference between our plan from our Terraform and our state? Sorry, not our plan. What's the difference between our configuration in our Terraform and our current state? And then impose whatever changes are required to reconcile that and make them match. Terraform format. So this one, just run that before you do any commits to Git. It's just to clean things up. So it'll move over your equal signs. It'll make sure that your curly braces are aligned properly. Just keeps code clean. Terraform apply. So this is the one that's going to actually make changes. So when you run an apply, there's always a plan before that. When you in the command, it does both plan and apply. So it'll do a plan, see what changes are expected, and then if they look good, you'll type yes, and it'll apply them. When you do this, you'll see there's four different types of changes that will appear in the apply. So you have a plus sign, which means you're adding a resource. A minus is removing a resource. You'll see a plus and minus, and that'll mean that you're destroying a resource and then building a new one from scratch. And then you'll see the tilde, which means that you're modifying an existing resource. And then Terraform destroy, you won't use this a ton, but in little projects like this where you're creating and then cleaning up, that'll just delete everything that Terraform manages in the state. Moving down, how can we organize this better? So we're going to set up our project directory, and we're going to have four key files. You'll see these files in just about every Terraform configuration. Main.tf, variables.tf, terraform.tf vars, and then outputs. So our main.tf is going to be like you just saw, configuring kind of the bulk of the resources or module calls as we'll get into. The variables explicitly just defining where your variables are going to be. Terraform.tf vars, so this will be the key values for what your variables are actually set to for the run. So you'll define what variables you want for your module, but then in your variables.tf, but then in the tf vars file, you actually set those values for when you're going to run this. And then outputs, this is anything like for your EC2 instance, you can output the IP address of it, and that way it's available within your Terraform code. Moving down, let's see how we define a variable. So this time it's going to be keyword variable and then the name of whatever your variable will be called. And there's 4 items that can come in here. So description, self-explanatory, type. So Terraform has types like most languages. I won't go into them. You can read the docs from Terraform if you're interested. A default value. This is basically if we don't pass in a variable, what do we want this to default to? And then the other thing is a validation block. So I can set things to say this variable must be 7 characters in length or else fail. So those are the 4 things you can include in a variable. None of them are required. I could just do variable instant type with empty curly braces and that would be fine, but try not to do that because it ends up being tech debt later on. So take note here, we're defining instance type and project name. Now we're going to incorporate them into our code. So here we're going to create a resource that's a AWS VPC. And if you want to know more about these resources, you can actually copy the resource type here and just look on Google for, you might not even need Terraform, but if you search this, it almost always comes up first. Terraform registry is where you'll want to look. And then from here, we can scroll down. Let me zoom in again. So this is going to give us a bunch of examples on how we can use this. It'll give us the argument reference, and then it'll also give us the attributes. So you can think about the arguments as what's going in, and the attributes are the outputs coming out. So moving down, cider block, that's self-explanatory. Name here, you'll see in tags, what we're doing is actually setting the string with the project name. So this is where the modules come into play. If we want to create a VPC module, we could actually tag it dynamically with the project name. So we would create this variable project name, and then this will change the name every time we call the module with a new project name defined. And scrolling down, subnet. The one thing I do want to reference here, I won't go through everything, but this is how we reference a Terraform resource from within our code. So we'll see here AWS VPC, it's referencing this resource. Main is the name of that resource, and then the ID, which is what we just looked at from the attribute reference. So we're pulling the ID out of this resource and inputting it to the subnet. So now we're going to talk about state. So state is what makes Terraform so great. Basically, the way this works is that we're defining our infrastructure configuration as Terraform HCL. We then run a plan and apply, and in that apply, we are making changes that use the underlying SDK to interact with our cloud provider. And those changes, while invoking change on the cloud resource, they also track everything in a state file, which is a large JSON file, so that we know exactly what we have in the cloud at that time. So then the Terraform will reference what the HCL is as it changes over time and what the current state is and reconcile those changes to make sure that they match. And that's how the change gets invoked on the cloud. So I would recommend while you're going through this tutorial, once you run apply, go read into the Terraform TF state file. Don't touch it. Don't make any changes directly in there. Only use the CLI, the Terraform CLI to do that. But just read through it and you'll kind of see like, oh, this is the value I set, that sort of thing. So state is really important. It's something you'll learn the basics very quickly and then kind of progressively learn more about it as you start using Terraform. So other key thing, you're going to almost always want a remote state. In this project, it's fine for your first demo where you're going to have it locally, but in any kind of team setting, you want to have a remote source of truth. So in this case, we would be configuring an S3 bucket to store our document, the state file, and that way we can have multiple people working off the state file at the same time. Otherwise, I just use Terraform Cloud. They build this really well. They have a freemium model, so you can do just about everything you need there unless you're provisioning a really large amount of resources. Next, get into best practices. So as you see here, we're going to have a higher level project. And then underneath that, we're going to want environments directory and a modules directory. So I'll go into modules first. These are usually standard modules. You want your modules to be reusable and to decompose your infrastructure in a way that makes sense logically, but allows them to be reused in multiple places so that you're not repeating code. So if you're building 10 different EC2 instances, but they're all different sizes, you should probably build a module that takes in an instance size and then invoke those modules from your environment. So next, we would move up to the environment. You'll have here, this shows a dev and a prod. So these would be exact replicas between main and the files between dev and prod, but we would make changes in dev, apply it there, and then make changes in prod. So this would be a simple workflow of a single like main branch, but you can get into more branching strategies using Git and kind of there's a few different ways you could set it up, but this is kind of the safest way that you can go to start, and then you'll see how things move, and you can kind of get a little more nuanced with it to fit your needs. But this is usually a good way to go. And finishing off here, you can read through these best practices. One thing I do want to point out, be careful with your variable usage. A lot of people, they kind of, once they get into it, they start setting everything as variables. And I think that's really wrong. You want to be setting your variables only when you know something's going to change, because the problem is that setting something as hard coded and then changing it to a variable is backwards compatible, but you can't go the other way. If you have a variable as an input and then you change it to a string, if that variable had more than one entry, then you're going to break someone's downstream infrastructure. So try to avoid that and keep things variables only where needed. Next steps I would recommend, if you go through this tutorial and you really want to learn more about Terraform, then I would look into building those modules. So we would just deploy an EC2 in this, try to build out this infrastructure or the directory structure here, and build a dev, build a prod, set your EC2 and your VPC to be named based off of your dev and prod. So set variables that name them automatically passed into the module, and then when you do that, you can start with dev, build out prod from there. You can start looking at branching strategies if you get interested, and then also learn about some of the CI/CD pipelines. So this would include things like setting up testing or Terraform linting or using the remote state in Terraform Cloud. These will be things that are really important and kind of the real benefits of using Terraform. So I would go there next. If you enjoyed the video, let me know what else you'd like to see in the comments below. Thanks for watching.